jazz guitar world. Every jazz guitar program that I know is kind of stovepiped. Within the universities, a lot of the faculty members barely talk to one another, let alone any kind of communication with other faculty members around the country. And I remember, was it with Barry? No, it wasn't with you. I was with another jazz guitar. No, maybe it was you. Barry and I were sitting in our office, and I had just come back from a trip visiting a lot of other guitar faculty programs, and was asking Barry if he knew some of the faculty members, and some of them he knew, some of them maybe he went to school with at some time, some of them maybe he played with, some of them he didn't know and didn't know there was a program there. And it sort of occurred to me that you know, you guys are all sort of teaching the same thing to the same demographic in all these different colleges and universities, and nobody really gets together and discusses it. And so I'm hoping that this is the first of a wave of jazz guitar festivals. Maybe Monty can write this up and publish it in Just Jazz Guitar magazine, and we'll start a trend of regional jazz guitar festivals. Would be pretty cool.
Okay.
And having other jazz guitar programs come here and intermingle is also cool for students. Cool for students, I think it's especially cool for the teachers. And it lets guys like me come and talk about the guitar industry. So my name's Howard Palm, President and CEO of Benedetto Guitars. Just give you a little background about the company. Bob Benedetto started building guitars in 1968, kind of on the heels of John D'Angelico. D'Angelico was the premier independent builder from about 1930 until 1964 he died, but he had his first heart attack in '59. At that point, Jimmy D'Acquisto took over most of the building, and then Bob, who's a couple of years younger than D'Acquisto, started building in '68, and pretty quickly rose to prominence among players. He was, while D'Acquisto in the '70s was, capitalizing on D'Angelico's work, he sort of had a ready-made audience for sales, and the guitars were getting pretty expensive. And so a lot of professional jazz guitarists wanted that quality of instrument, but couldn't afford the 5-year wait and the price tag that went along with the D'Acquisto. So a lot of them started coming to Bob Benedetto. You just heard Tal Farlow. Tal had one of Bob's guitars for a little while. Chuck Wayne played Benedetto's. Bucky Pizzarelli's played them for 40 years. So pretty long history of jazz guitar greats, Kenny Burrell.
Didn't Joe Diorio had one, didn't
Joe
he?
Diorio played a Benedetto. So a lot of, not Kenny Poole, but other guy up in Ohio, career player in Ohio. Anyway, Bob sort of got a reputation of building guitars for guitar players rather than guitar collectors, and rose to prominence so that by 1992 he was considered, with Jimmy D'Acquisto, one of the top 2 jazz guitar builders, independent builders alive. And he had a lot of apprentices along the way. He was really willing to share the construction methodology and materials and things like that. So guitars that you see built by John Buscarino or Dale Unger, Bill Cummins, Gary Mortoro, a lot of those guys apprenticed under Bob, and then there's a whole generation of players that asked him questions and came to visit him and took seminars from him. So his style of building kind of transcends a lot of different Archtop builders. In 1991, he wrote a book called Making an Archtop Guitar, How to Make an Archtop Guitar. I'm sorry I don't have a copy of it with me, but he pretty much spilled the beans. These were all very secretive independent luthiers, and they teach things to their apprentices, but they wouldn't publicize how they were building these instruments because they didn't want competition. Bob, in 1992, It was a 3.5 to 5 year wait for his instruments, and he was charging, you know, $8,000 to $10,000 back in '92, '93 for an instrument, some a lot more, and he felt like it would be a disservice not to let other guitar builders learn from his history. So he published this book and created a renaissance period in guitar building. Today, I think there are probably more independent builders than there have ever been, and the quality of guitars is better than they've ever been, and the prices are a lot more affordable for independently built guitars because there are a lot more people doing it. So it sort of changed the industry. So that was '92, he published that book. By '98, he had instruments and a permanent collection of the Smithsonian. And as not a big surprise, in '99, Fender Musical Instruments approached Bob about taking the brand over and building his instruments. And the same thing had happened at the Acquisto and the Angelico and Stromberg, and all those families had sort of given up the names over the big manufacturers. So Bob in '99 signed a licensing agreement. He didn't sell his brand, but he signed a licensing agreement to Fender. Took in 2 of Fender's top custom shop luthiers, trained them how to make Benedetto guitars according to his book, and then exported his shop to Fender, initially in Nashville Custom Shop, and eventually they moved it to Corona Custom Shop. And the top luthier from Fender at the time was a guy named Steve Anderson, and he was building Bob Benedetto's guitars in the Fender Custom Shop, exactly as Bob had built them. And Bob would fly out there one week a month and visit the shop, check on the quality. He used to carry a ball peen hammer with him, and he'd destroy guitars that he didn't think could be salvaged, and other instruments he'd have them rework it. Not a single guitar was ever allowed to leave the shop without Bob doing the final inspection. And you can imagine if he's only there, you know, 4 or 5 days a month, it's really hard to produce guitars that way. He'd show up, he'd have them rework different things. Maybe the rework would only take, you know, 3 or 4 hours, but if he had left, they weren't allowed to put it on a guitar and send it out until he came back and checked it. So it was not a particularly good marriage for Fender because they couldn't produce guitars at the volume they wanted. It wasn't very good for Bob because a lot of players who were playing Fender-built Benedettos kind of thought Bob was a sellout because he wasn't making them himself, even though they were the same price. You know, if you wanted a Fender Manhattan in 2001, it was a $24,000 guitar. A Benedetto Manhattan in 1998 or 1997 was an $11,000 guitar. So people got a little pissed off that Fender was building them, and even though they were great instruments, it wasn't Bob, and he didn't have, you know, at least perceived control over it. So, and music stores hated it because now, if they wanted to carry Fender instruments, they had to carry Benedetto guitars, and a lot of these guys really weren't interested in investing in, you know, a $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 Archtop guitar when they could have an entire wall of Chinese guitars for the same price. So in 2006, Bob Benedetto decided that the relationship really needed to end if he was going to protect his brand and continue his legacy. And so he gave me a call. I was initially one of his customers and eventually one of his players, but I had a day job at the time as vice president of a steel company. It gave me about 140 days a year, so I was still playing full time. And Bob said, you know, I want to take the brand away from Fender. Are you interested in helping me build a factory? Be my business partner. And I live in Savannah, Georgia. I said, as long as we do it in Savannah, Georgia, I'm in. And so Bob packed up his home. At the time, he was living in Tampa area and moved to Savannah. And I went down to the local bookstore and bought, you know, business plan for dummies or something like that. Figured out how to write a business plan. And together the private equity we needed and started Benedetto's. So Benedetto Guitars in its current form has been in Savannah since 2006. We still make everything exactly the way Bob made it. We have all his molds, all his tools, still some of his wood, even after the last 8 years. We still keep some stuff that he had, for 30 years. All his workbenches are still there. Bob retired, full-time retirement beginning December 2014. For the last 8 years, his direct apprentice and assistant has been a guy named Damon Mylan. And when Bob retired, he gave Damon his workbench, and he gave him his tools, and he gave him all his molds and fixtures. And so today, Damon Mylan continues to build Benedetto guitars exactly as Bob, maybe even better, because there's a lot of consistency in the shop that Bob didn't have when he was an independent builder. We make about 120 instruments a year. Almost everything we make is ordered, custom ordered. Even though we make standard models, we build to order. So typically someone wants to buy one of our guitars, it's about an 8-month wait, and we custom build it for whoever they are. And then maybe 6 or 7% of our production are spec guitars, like this one and these two are part of our inventory. These are the only 3 guitars I have that aren't actually owned by anybody. We'll try and sneak a couple in just so I have some inventory that we're able to sell as needed, and everything else is to order. So today Bob and his wife Cindy Benedetto are retired, living in Ocala, Florida, and he is, I don't know if I call him a full-time guitarist, but he probably gigs 2 or 3 nights a week now. Yeah. Barry's been down there and played with him before, and he's really dedicated himself to going back to being a musician after spending 45 years, hunched over a workbench, which is pretty cool. So that's a little bit about the company. Now let's talk a little bit about guitars and guitar history. I've done this lecture, I don't know, for the last 6, 7 years at different conservatories and music programs around the country. Anybody here ever heard this before or seen me talk? Yeah, so you can go to sleep if you want. Or correct me when I make an error. And eventually we'll get to the point where we'll demonstrate the differences between these guitars and how they're constructed. And I'll recruit Barry to help me do that. And once we're finished, all these guitars are going to stay here all day. So you guys are all welcome, once we're finished, to pick them up and play them, try them out. I will remind you that this guitar, and this guitar are new for sale guitars. Y'all are welcome to play them. If you're going to drop one, drop this one or this one, which is my personal.
I love that last one.
Yeah.
Nice.
But those are prototype. This is my personal guitar. That one's a prototype.
Okay.
And so they're both used to shop wear and gigs. I'm not worried about those, but the newer ones, they need to stay new, so handle them as gingerly as you can. So the guitar as an instrument has been around for hundreds of years. And what makes it different from orchestral instruments is it was designed from the very beginning to be a parlor instrument. It's got a relatively low voice, it doesn't project well, sort of in the same category of lutes and mandolins, and they were designed as folk instruments to accompany human voice, maybe a little bit of dance. They were never legitimate orchestral instruments, and in fact, up until recently, if you went to any major conservatory, like Juilliard, for example, you couldn't get a degree in guitar performance because there was never enough legitimate music written for the guitar to warrant issuing a degree. It wasn't really until Segovia in the 30s that composers started writing things specific for guitar, and classical music that was written for harpsichord and other legitimate classical instruments was transcribed for guitar. But even up until the 90s, you couldn't get a degree in classical guitar because because you can't play it in an orchestra. And that's why nobody wrote for it. And the reason you can't play it in an orchestra is because it's an architecturally flawed instrument. And then, so everybody recognizes I'm not an artist, by the way, if you haven't figured that out yet, you're about to. So, traditional guitar, as everybody knows, oval hole, flat top, the bridge glued directly to the top of the instrument. Earlier ones had rounded backs, but these were never built like violins. If you look at this instrument from the side, it's got a thin flat sawn top and a thin flat sawn back. Both the top and the back typically have some bracing. The bridge is glued right to the top of the instrument with a bridge saddle. And the strings, whether they're nylon strings or gut strings, the earliest instruments, are tied, or modern guitars have, a peg and a button on the end of the string. But either way, they're affixed to this glued bridge that's glued to the top. And of course, when you begin to put tension on the string, what you're doing is you're pulling, or putting tension on the top of the instrument, pulling it away from itself. So this would fail, and they often do fail anyway. Either the glue gives up, or the tops can warp. The only way to protect that from happening is to pretty heavily brace the underside of this. It's got to be thin enough to vibrate, but it's got to be strong enough to keep that tension from pulling away. So if you open up one of the tops of these guitars, what do you find? You find all kinds of bracing. And every manufacturer has a different pattern, different materials, different thicknesses, all of which will tell you it's what makes their guitars better and louder than every other guitar. But the fact remains that this architecture doesn't work unless you have this bracing keeping the top stiff. And by keeping the top stiff, it prevents energy from traveling into the top and vibrating to push air. So the physics are, you pluck a string, the energy from the string goes into the bridge, and the bridge saddle causes the top to vibrate, which pushes air, and as you know, all sound is moving air. Unfortunately, with all the bracing, it's limited how much this top can move up and down. So the energy's got to go somewhere, so it dissipates through the sides, it dissipates through the back, and the entire guitar winds up in motion in order to generate enough air at any tone for you to be able to hear. So even though there's a hole in the top of the instrument to allow air to escape towards the audience, because it's so heavily braced, there's only so much air moving through this instrument anyway, and the entire thing is vibrating. That's why nylon string guitars and flat top, steel string flat top guitars sound best to the guy who's playing them and somebody within 10 feet. And the farther away you go, the faster the decay of sound and bass response and penetration, because somebody decided they were going to glue the bridge to the top. So that was all well and good, because all music that was written and played for instruments was folk music and parlor music, and it was appropriate to accompany the human voice and other similar instruments, so the design worked fine, up until the jazz era. And so the jazz era started in the late teens, right? In New Orleans, I think 1912 to 1915, and it's kind of a birth of what we think of today as American jazz art form. The earliest versions of it, come from Storyville, and indoor they were piano players playing this amalgamation of American music and African rhythms and some European influences, French, Polynesian music, all sort of came together in one spot with this Creole influence. in New Orleans. So this is really the beginning of jazz. The piano was the entertainment in the brothels in Storyville, and the rest of the instruments were mostly ceremonial, used for weddings and funerals in jazz parades. So what was the instrumentation? Well, it was New Orleans in 1910, 1915. There's no air conditioning. Anybody live in New Orleans or spend any time there? It's hot, it's really humid, it's mosquito infested. Up until, probably the teens, a lot of the streets were mud. Everything's below sea level. And so wooden instruments didn't fare particularly well in the streets. So the earliest New Orleans bands were kind of marching instruments bands. They had marching drums and cymbals. They had metal cornets, trumpets, trombones, tubas played the bass lines, metal clarinets, and if there was a rhythm instrument, it was usually a banjo, which was a resonator instrument that was loud and could withstand the elements, but no offense to any banjo players here, but it sounded like a banjo. So that was really the early influence of jazz. There was no guitar because this instrument wasn't suitable for carrying around in a parade. It wasn't loud enough to project through all those other instruments anyway. That changed in about 1916, and if there's a better music historian here, please speak up. But about 1916, there was an enormous syphilis outbreak in New Orleans. And of course, New Orleans is a major port, so the U.S. Navy came down with a major outbreak or epidemic of syphilis. And the government's response to that was to get rid of all the bordellos. So they burned down a 16 square block area called Storyville. And along with that, all the musicians who lived and worked and thrived in New Orleans were forced out along with a lot of prostitutes. And so that was kind of a diaspora for jazz musicians who naturally started up the Mississippi River and started their own unique forms of music branching out along the Mississippi and places eventually like Memphis and St. Louis. But the hardcore guys, they wound up all the way up in Chicago. So now you're talking the early 20s in Chicago, which was much more of a cultural center than New Orleans was. More orchestras, more schools, more sophisticated musicians, and more sophisticated instruments. Of course, New Orleans is a little different climate than Chicago. So there were no parades outside Chicago in January, February, and March taking place. Music was an indoor activity in Chicago as opposed to entirely an outdoor activity in New Orleans. So for the first time, jazz musicians had access on a regular basis to more classical European instruments and started intermingling with more classically trained American musicians in Chicago. That was one thing that drove them in was weather. The other thing that drove them in, of course, was Prohibition. So the early 20s, we had Prohibition.